In this video, I'll go into the idea of reincarnation, which really just means coming back to life after death. This is popular among certain religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, but I'm going to explain it in a more logical way to create a good argument for the experience of new life after death. First, we need to break down what life actually is. In order to build anything consistently and reliably, it is important to have a reliable set of instructions and tools. The instructions for building life is stored in a molecule called RNA, or ribonucleic acid. What RNA stores information as is 4 different molecules, which can be abbreviated to A, U, G, and C. This information is really just 2 or 3 diagonal hydrogen bonds, which allow it to be easily read, and allows for RNA to be tied together to form what is called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA for short. DNA is really just a more stable way of storing RNA, which allows you to have more instructions. Messenger RNA, or mRNA, is basically the final instructions that are read, and transfer RNA, or tRNA, is what builds stuff. Each 3 sections of mRNA represent a different amino acid, of which there are about 64 different choices or possibilities. What tRNA will do is join a set of amino acids together to make the proteins that form parts of a living thing or machines that make parts of a living thing. Things like cell walls are bubbles of fat, so they are indirectly built from RNA using protein machines. This really means life is a set of instructions that can copy itself. All of the diversity seen in life on Earth is purely driven by trying to copy better than other organisms in a given environment. Because this doesn't explain our sort of personal experience of life, only how we are actually made, we need to look more closely at what gives us our life experience. This leads us to brains. Brains are simply a way to increase the complexity of outputs based on past and present inputs. What this means is that a brain is a future prediction machine that has evolved mostly to recognize patterns in the environment and attempt to control these patterns. This is an enormous factor for reproductive success on Earth, and is why around 80% of our genome is solely used to build different parts of the brain. Let's break down how the brain makes important calculations to create decisions. Firstly, the brain receives inputs from what is called the ascending reticular activating system, or ARAS for short, from the spinal cord. These signals of the spinal cord are very simple, and new developments from Neuralink and other older developments in the CIA's MK Ultra program that could make dogs stop moving with a remote control have shown that triggering a movement is quite a simple operation, and is really just activating a strand of nerve. The second part in the process is where the brain starts to deviate from how you might think it would work. Before the raw sensory data reaches the sensory organizer and relay called the thalamus, some inputs are sent to the emotional centers, which are critically important in fear, called the amygdala, or amygdala for singular. The ascending sensory information isn't blocked, but it is handed to the amygdala as information travels up the brain. This means the emotional center will always process information first because it is very quick at processing compared to higher level processors. If something bad is detected, the amygdala will send commands to other regions of the brain to do something that can heavily affect how we consciously perceive something. Another important thing to note is that depending on the type of input, it can be handed off to other regions of the brain for processing, like the visual cortex for visual information. This process has to be quick as possible, mostly because one of the most dangerous things to our ancestors for millions of years was snakes. And the brain has to be able to immediately detect snakes hidden in the environment very quickly, because if you are slower than the snake, you died. When the various inputs reach the thalamus, they are further broken down into various sections and categories in order to make processing faster for other regions of the brain. This is a massively important part of the brain, and deficits in this structure of the thalamus lead to things like autism, because incoming information is not organized as simply or as well as other people, making other parts of the brain either having to increase the time they spend on processing, or just shutting down large sections of input in order to try and get the correct input. After being organized by the thalamus, different inputs are sent in a very condensed and organized manner to other sections of the brain. These outputs are very specific and are solely based on a set of various different types of informational patterns that are consistent across most living things. The information patterns were first described by a very famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who called it the superconscious, which he basically described as something below the unconscious that was consistent across every human. So to break this down, your brain receives sensory inputs, quickly checks for anything dangerous, then sends it to the sensory organizer and relay to be sent to other regions of the brain. The reward system will apply a weighting system to this information, which will change when and how carefully it is handled. Your brain can then analyze the input it received against past experience. Then it can send outputs if it thinks it is necessary, like movement or hormones. But really, the brain gets information, analyzes it, then creates outputs. Most of the conscious experience is the analysis step, where you are effectively a group of parts of the brain working together. When you visualize an image, it is your visual cortex working. For long-term memory access, it is the temporal lobe. Any emotions are the amygdala and the effects they have on other regions. A good way to think about your brain is a set of functions that form a web of connections that are constantly sending and receiving information with each other. Now we can move on to the idea of reincarnation, that is, coming back to life after death. First, we need to separate every living thing as its own individual object. In terms of physics, the universe calculates all of us simultaneously, and because our brain is purely defined as a function of physics, we can break down our life experience as a set of various processes used to make us and eventually the universe. The physical calculation of us is within the set of calculations of the universe, and calculations of neurons and atoms are within the set of our calculations. While everyone else is being calculated at the same time, and also within the set of the calculations of the universe, as humans we can't sense or be other humans at the same time because the way we interpret information is localized to our own brains. So all of our current experience is really within our own brains. Now we can imagine if we broke our brain down into an unorganized soup of atoms, that you wouldn't be there. But if we were to bring that soup back into the same formation as your brain before, my main argument is that the reconfigured brain isn't a copy of you, but it is you, and that you wouldn't notice that anything happened. The core of this idea is that your experience is created by the atomic interactions within your brain that produce a method of sorting and organizing information through neural networks. The tricky part of this idea is that if we reconfigure the atom of a brain into two animals, say two rats, which rat would you become? I believe you'd actually sort of become both. While the rats aren't telepathically connected, they would be two separate organisms. Unfortunately, you can't really be two things at once. Whichever organism has the most of your atoms does not solve this problem either, because you are constantly changing atoms. It is just the configuration that remains the same and keeps the cells effectively the same. Thinking in this way, your brain is actually just a molded shape. Because this shape and the interactions are created via electrons, mostly, it would be safe to say that it is actually to do with your electrons and not the atoms as a whole. I think an important thing to note is that if your electrons are used in another life form after death, you would still technically become that organism. The problem comes with your electrons spreading to multiple organisms. A key point to note is that your life thread, or electrons that created you, would still really be alive, just spread across multiple organisms. A good way to think of your current state right now is a dough that has been molded into a shape to make you. Food is replacing small parts of that dough and molding it into the same shape as the piece that was taken away. Because when we die, our electrons are spread out between millions of different bacteria and smaller organisms, we could say the dough that makes you up is changed into and spread out across all of these different creatures. So now the function of your brain has been converted into the function of many different bacteria and smaller insects. Where electrons have been spread out across many organisms, the new you would actually attach to a single organism. Different parts of you might be spread out across them, but your new experience would be within a single bacteria. As these bacteria and small insects are eaten by larger things, parts of which are even transformed into plants, your experience would be absorbed by something larger. The larger organism doesn't remember the experience of that bacteria or animal, because its experience is based off the loop of the processes within its brain. I suspect the smaller organism effectively joins together with the larger organism, switching the life experience of the smaller organism to that of the larger organism. So in a way, if a tiger was to eat a mouse, the mouse's consciousness would be effectively transferred to the tiger. Well, this might not be precisely the case, because there isn't a perfect transfer between the mouse and the tiger's brain. It would still cause your experience to eventually lead to larger animals, because they consume a very large quantity of smaller animals and plants through the food chain. This ends up creating a process where what you would consider threads of life are constantly spread out and wound together over many different lives. Let's go through this entire process from death to a higher level organism. So your brain dies and then is converted into many different bacteria. These bacteria might get eaten up by a plant, so now you're attached to that plant. The plant dies and then a cockroach eats that plant, just pretending it's small. Then a lizard eats that cockroach. You are now that lizard. Using this idea, over time, we can see that a whole bunch of different life threads have reached the larger animal with you. What is important to note is that you'll be broken down into millions of these life threads, but you specifically will only end up being a single one again. Basically, you'll just be a single bacteria, but then slowly make your way back up to higher level organisms. Because you can't be all the bacteria at once, you basically end up being placed into a single bacteria's life thread. Bacteria do not feel time, so you would feel like you were instantly placed into the first thing your thread reaches that has a brain. Because there are so many humans and bacteria don't travel extremely far, it would be a reasonable assumption that you would probably end up becoming human again in the local area of where your body was. In order to shorten this video, I will give a very short explanation of how I went through certain areas of the brain and what the critically important areas are that sort of hold your conscious experience. Most of the higher level regions of the brain, which are just the parts further away from the center in a spiral starting backwards, are really just a way to extend a particular type of processing. Well, you don't need a visual cortex to find a sensory pattern. It greatly increases the complexity of visual patterns you can interpret and understand. Because these parts are only really an extension of the conscious experience, we can take them away and still be somewhat conscious. The core aspect of consciousness is really just the process of reliably organizing information. I would argue that a computer could be conscious quite easily because it can achieve the same goals as our brain, just that we haven't programmed them in a complex enough way to be considered on our level. So the parts of your brain that are required for your current sort of experience are to do with information organization and filtering. This leads us to these sort of final areas of the thalamus, which is used to organize information and send it around the brain. The anterior cingulate cortex, which basically creates your ego. It checks for errors and will warp information to help survive. And some parts of the ascending reticular activating system, which are also used to sort of filter information. Pointing to a set of physical parts of the brain might not necessarily be the correct way of thinking about it, because it could be sort of a field created between electrons that produces this whole process. The main point is that when you die, your atoms and electrons that give you life and the computation of your brain will eventually be used in another organism. This transfers the process that created your brain into something else, giving you life in something else. A way to think about it is a string of electrons that go through all life forms. Once this string reaches a life form, the experience attached to those electrons gets stuck in that life form, or the shape of that life form. Only when the formation of that organism dissolves can the electrons be used in another life form again. The most important thing to remember is that we are a part of life on Earth that is built on a chain of reactions made up of smaller parts. We are a part of what makes up the universe calculation. We are a part of what makes up Earth. Because our calculations won't leave Earth for a while, any change in how what we are made up of is organized will still be under the calculations of Earth. You are stuck here forever.